Hello, everybody. My name is Margaret Prophet, and thank you for everyone for attending the 100 Debates on the Environment for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte. Myself and Adam and Kelly, who are working in the background, we represent Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition. And we've organized these debates. We have one today and we have one in Barrie Innisfil later, and we're also helping with York Simcoe and Simcoe Grey to talk about these issues that are important to us. So we know that strong environmental concerns and policies set the course for the health of our community, our waters, and the planet. Climate change is the #1 threat to our public health, economy, and livable communities. Today's candidates are vying for the opportunity to take this matter seriously and advocate on behalf of our shared environment at the federal level. We can no longer afford policy to exacerbate climate breakdown or delay climate action. The time is now. Before we get started on the debate, I wanted to take a few minutes to first acknowledge the lands that we're situated on. We are on the traditional Indigenous territories of the Anishinaabe people. Locally, we'd like to honor the Chippewas Tri-Council, which is comprised of Rama First Nation, Georgina Island First Nation, Bosa Island First Nation, and acknowledge that their ancestors were first stewards of these lands. Via the William Treaty and others, agreements were made that these lands were meant to be shared and in a way that honors nature and the life that we've been given. History and present day issues clearly demonstrate that we are not living up to this intention or promise. To have hope for the future generations, we must recognize the value in each other, reconcile for past and ongoing tragedies, and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. Further, we must recognize that the various components of our ecosystem are interdependent and need to work in harmony. The only way forward is together. As potential members of the Parliament, we at SCGC and the other partners that have helped organize tonight are asking our candidates to uphold choices and policies that address truth and reconciliation. For today's all candidates meeting, I will review the structure before we get started. Each candidate will be asked to answer 7 preset questions that were shared with candidates prior to the debate. We will then select 3 questions from the audience. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature in the menu. Questions must be addressed to all candidates, be respectful, and pertain to environmental concerns. For each question, candidate will have 1.5 minutes to respond. We will be notifying the candidate at 30-second and 10-second time remaining mark. Once the time has expired, the candidate will be muted and I will announce the next candidate's turn. Before the meeting, organizers and candidates met to randomly select the order of speakers for each question. Finally, we urge each of you to encourage others to vote and put the health and well-being of our communities and planet at the forefront of your decisions. The meeting is being recorded and the final video will be available on Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition's YouTube channel. Thank you to all the candidates for your community service, and we wish them all the best in their campaigns. And today joining us, we have Doug Shipley, who is the candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada. We have Tanya Saari, who's the candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada. And we have Saari Lochhead, who is the candidate for the NDP. To begin, we're going to start with introductions. Each candidate has 1 minute. And for this component, Sarah will be going first, followed by Tanya and then Doug. And Sarah, your 1 minute begins.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all here today. So as a new mom, not a day goes by that I'm not thinking about the world that we're leaving for upcoming generations, or in fact, if there will be a livable world for them at all. So with extreme weather events being reported every day, some of which are happening right here in our region, it's more than clear that we're in the throes of a climate crisis. And this is not acceptable. We need to fight the climate crisis like we're going to win. And a new Democratic government has a plan to do just that, which I'm excited to share with you in this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanya, you are next.
Perfect, thank you. I just want to thank you guys for having me as well, and nice to see Doug and Sarah on here. My name is Tanya Saari. I am the Liberal candidate for the Barrie Springwater Oro-Medonte riding. I'm excited to be a part of this introduction with everybody today. This is my first time running in a federal position, and I've been a resident of this area for 16 years and have seen a lot of evolution of our communities over those 16 years that we've been here. I'm proud to say that I'm part of a party that has got a really, really comprehensive climate change plan and something that's going to help us move forward for a cleaner and greener future. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of those thoughts with all of you throughout the next hour. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Doug, you are the final.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. I am Doug Shipley. I would first like to extend my sincere thanks to Canada's 100 Debates on the Environment event organizers for planning this debate. It's great to have an additional opportunity to speak about the Conservative Party's plan to secure the environment. Secondly, and most importantly, I would like to thank everyone in attendance for tuning in to learn about the Conservative Party's environment platform. Thanks also to my fellow candidates for being here today. Along with my colleagues in the Conservative Party, I am concerned with the ever-increasing global climate crisis. Our party has put together a great plan to secure the environment. The Conservative Party has a feasible plan to fight climate change and protect the environment, but won't do it on the backs of hardworking Canadians. Our plan is based around the low carbon savings account, a zero emission vehicle mandate, lower industrial emissions, and a carbon border tariff. Throughout this next hour, I would like to expand on our plan to fight climate change and protect the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first of our preset questions, the candidates have 1.5 minutes for each of these questions. Here is question number 1. We are asking 3 yes or no questions that each deal with immediate measures the government can take to address the climate crisis while protecting the health of Canadians as we emerge from the worst of this pandemic. The questions are, and there's 3 separate little ones, yes or no questions within it. Will you develop a new and credible plan to halt and reverse nature loss, protect species at risk, and meet Canada's commitment to protect at least 30% of land, freshwater, and ocean by 2030? Will you commit to require all sectors to reduce carbon emissions by 60% by 2030 and make it law? And will you push your party's leadership to end all government subsidies for and investments in fossil fuel infrastructure such as pipelines and new highways? We ask the candidates to ensure that they include a yes or no response for each question given, in addition to any additional comments. For this question, Tanya is going first, followed by Doug, and then Sarah. Tanya, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll just answer part 1 of the question with the 30% of land, freshwater, and ocean. I'm actually really proud to be running on a platform that is committed to building a cleaner, greener, and more sustainable environment for current and future generations. So yes to that. Our government has actually already committed to and is working towards protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. As outlined in our ambitious platform, we will implement the recently passed Net Zero Accountability Act and advance new measures to achieve a 40 to 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. And for the third part, yes, our party has already committed to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies by 2023, which is 2 years ahead of our G20 partners. So there is no question that we need to reduce and eventually end our reliance on fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug, you are next for question 1. Your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thanks. I keep forgetting we're running our own mutes through this, correct? I had it on mute, so pardon me. The Conservative Party remains committed to not only reaching the target set by the previous Conservative government in 2010 to conserve 17% of terrestrial lands through protected areas and other local conservative measures. In fact, we will increase the goal to 25%. It is important to note that under the current Liberal government, Canada has reached just 12% of that target. Part 2, I recognize the reality of climate change and its impact on our ecosystems and our communities. Conservatives will fight climate change and protect the environment, but we won't do it on the backs of hardworking Canadians. The solution is not as simple as increasing a carbon tax on Canadians year after year. To reach our goal, we will work with provinces to make Canada a leader in climate action, recognizing that the most efficient way to reduce our emissions is to use pricing mechanisms and not ignoring the fact that the US does not yet have a national carbon pricing system, and the present state of global trade allows some of the world's worst pollutants to become free riders to the detriment of Canadian workers. Part 3, over 40,000 jobs have disappeared from Alberta in the last 7 years. That reality has had a devastating impact on workers, families, and communities, and we simply can't leave behind people in any sector or region across Canada, high and dry, as we transition from fossil fuels. Putting people out of work and forcing families to move out of their communities, including Indigenous communities, is not a solution. It's not as simple as turning off the oil and gas sector. People who work in Alberta and trying to pay their bills and get through COVID, just like workers and families in all regions. I truly believe we must support people across the country, in all regions and sectors, and residents need opportunities to make a good living and support their families. Conservatives will support youth trying to get into the labor force, and we will provide funding and support to enable women-led small businesses in all communities to thrive and cut red tape to make it easier to get a business off the ground.
Thank you. We're moving on to question 2. Again, you have 1.5 minutes each. Question 2, emergency mobilizations require social cohesion.
Sorry, Margaret, I
But
did
any-
not have a chance to respond.
Oh, sorry about that. My mistake. Sarah, I am ahead of the game here. See, you guys
It's
were so quick.
okay.
I'm just like, sorry. See, we knew there was going to be something go wrong. My
All
apologies,
good.
Sarah. Yes,
All
you
good.
have-
No worries.
we have 1.5 minutes now for you to answer question 1. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, well, with respect to protecting 30% of our land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030, yes, the NDP will do that. Part of these plans include enshrining in law an environmental bill of rights, and we plan to also ensure that the Species at Risk Act is enforced and launch a 10-year nature plan to reverse species loss, as well as working with farmers and communities to monitor biodiversity and protect pollinator health. And we also want to implement a national freshwater strategy. So that's for that part. That's what we're going to do. With reducing carbon emissions to 60%, what we will do is what the science requires of us. And we have a plan to cut emissions by more than half to meet 1.5-degree targets that scientists say will prevent a catastrophe. We also plan to create a climate accountability office, which will provide independent oversight of the federal climate progress to engage the public and to make recommendations on how to best achieve those goals. So under Trudeau, we've had the weakest 2030 climate target of any G7 country. And as an NDP MP, I will be a strong voice in Ottawa fighting to protect our environment. And for the third part, yes, we plan to, we know that funds are best spent supporting the transition to renewable energy. And so we are committed to Canada's G20 commitment to eliminate these fossil fuel subsidies and redirect the funds to low carbon initiatives and green energy initiatives such as public transit.
Perfect. Thank you. My apologies. Hopefully, you need to pay better moderators, I guess, here in this for SCGC, because I made a bad mistake here. Okay, we're moving on to question 2. We have to have a little bit of liveliness, right? Question 2, again, you have 1.5 minutes. Question 2 goes as this. Emergency mobilizations require social cohesion, but inequality undermines such collaboration. The COVID-19 pandemic has further lifted the veil on the inequities in our country. How do you propose to tackle the climate crisis and these inequities at the same time? One required element of doing so is referred to as a just transition. What do you think is the role of the federal government in ensuring no one is left behind in the grand decarbonization transition before us? For this question, Doug will be going first, followed by Sarah and then Tanya. So Doug, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you for this great question. The number of Canadians that have been unemployed for more than 6 months is stuck near its highest level ever. More and more people are spending months on end unemployed and searching for jobs. This is affecting all communities, including Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte, and it has affected racialized and marginalized Canadians more than any other group. Conservatives are worried that millions of Canadian workers and small businesses are being left behind. Our top priority is getting Canadians back to work in good jobs in every sector and every region of Canada. Youth unemployment has skyrocketed and remains high. Lower income workers, particularly in the hospitality and service sectors, have been devastated. We will focus on getting people back to work in all sectors, including the hardest hit. Canada's Conservatives will create jobs through our jobs plan, providing stability and supporting recovery in every sector. We will continue to champion human rights for all Canadians with respect to creating jobs in all regions and sectors, tackling the housing crisis and making life more affordable for Canadian families. However, it's not just enough to create jobs. We also need to ensure that Canadian workers have the skills they need to fill those jobs, and in doing so, build a better life for themselves and their families. Canada's recovery plan will invest in job training opportunities, particularly for skilled trade workers, to better prepare them for jobs of today and tomorrow, as well as investing in opportunities to bring women and new Canadians into skilled trades by doubling the apprenticeship job creation tax credit for the next 3 years to help create more places for apprentices.
Thank you, Doug. Next, Sarah, your 1.5 minutes for question 2 begins now.
Thanks so much. So the climate emergency, it isn't just a threat to our environment, it's a clear and present danger to the health and well-being of all Canadians right across the country. And of course, As we're seeing, these effects are being borne disproportionately on the most vulnerable people in our communities, and a new Democratic government is committed to creating an Office of Environmental Justice to specifically address these disproportionate impacts of pollution and loss of biodiversity on low-income, racialized, and other marginalized communities. The Conservatives are clinging a bit to the old fossil fuel economy. In their 2019 election platform, the Liberals promised a Just Transition Act, but then failed to deliver. The New Democrats know that we can do better for all workers, including those whose work may change during this grand decarbonization. So what we're committed to doing is working with the provinces and working on access to education throughout people's professional lives, including proactive training and retraining, as well as supporting people when they're unemployed. This includes expanding options for workers in designated sectors to take EI training funds in advance of losing a job. And so that's a big aspect of what we want to do, as well as create a workers development and opportunities fund to expand training options specifically to people who are marginalized workers and are transitioning to different sectors. So that they have literacy and essential skills, because this transition isn't going to be easy, but it's necessary to do it in a way where no one is left behind.
Thank you. And finally, Tanya, for question 2, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect, thank you. So will you commit to a green and just pandemic recovery? My answer to that question is a wholehearted yes. While we need to move to a new green economy, we must make sure everybody is supported. Our government actually has already committed to and funded a green and just pandemic recovery program. In fact, it launched $53.6 billion in green recovery and climate action spending last year. To address disproportionate impacts on women, we announced and funded $10 a day childcare. And I know as a mom myself with 3 kids, that would have made a huge difference in my life had I had that when I was working with younger children. So we have also committed to reintroducing 2 bills that seek to address impacts on marginalized groups. The first one being a bill on environmental justice that will examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and exposure to environmental risk. The other legislation to strengthen the Environmental Protection Act, including recognizing the right to a healthy environment for the first time in federal law. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody went that time. I made sure. We're on to question 3, 1.5 minutes again. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is our overarching law to protect the health and environment of Canadians. The act has not been significantly amended since 1999, despite major changes in our understanding of toxic substances in our environment. A recent bill introduced in the last parliament did not make it past first reading. Will you support getting this bill reintroduced, strengthened, and make a top legislative priority? For this question, Sarah is going first, followed by Tanya, and then finally Doug. Sarah, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thanks so much. So I find that really shocking that it hasn't been updated since 1999. So I was in grade 12 at that time. So that was a long time ago. So yes, I'm on board to getting this bill reintroduced. I'm committed to expanding environmental protections and support enshrining the right to a healthy environment in a Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights. I feel that's very important, and ensure that all communities are guaranteed clean water, land, and air. New Democrat MPs will strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act by improving on Bill C-28 to better protect Canadians from toxic substances and toughen the federal environmental impact assessment process for new coal mines, mine expansions, or any type of project that is going to have a significant impact on the environment. We will also get tough on big polluters and support forcing large oil companies to pay to clean up inactive wells, which would create jobs for workers while cleaning up environmental hazards. So those are some of the things we're looking to do to help with toxics in our environment. And, you know, I do find it shocking, even in everyday products, the amount of toxins that are there. And that's something that I feel very hyper aware of when I'm looking at different products for my child. So it's definitely of importance and top of mind.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, Tanya, for question 3, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Sorry, I did the mute thing too. I almost forgot to unmute, sorry. Yes, so residents of Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte, and myself, we love and want to protect Lake Simcoe, and I think that's a really important thing for us to consider when we're thinking about this as well. My kids, I love taking my kids to Johnson's Beach. I always have. I hope someday I have grandkids and I can take them there. So, I mean, that's why it's really important to me that I would push to have this bill reintroduced into Parliament, and also not just to push it in, but get a quick and early passage of it. So, yeah, this is a really important thing. I think also the bill requires a mandatory labeling of consumer products, such as cosmetics and household cleaning products. And I think it was mentioned, we all want to know and have a right to know what it is that are in the things that we buy. So also a really important thing to have passed. Thank you.
Thank you. And Doug, for question 3, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thank you, Margaret. And Sarah, just to get back to what you said, in 1999, I wish I could say I was still in school, but I don't have that liberty. So thank you for putting that into perspective and making me feel a little older today. In regards to Bill C-28, an act to amend the EPA, was introduced in the House of Commons on April 13th, 2021, and it died when the Liberals decided to call an unnecessary election. Bill C-28 proposes amendments that are intended to address the historical criticism that SEPA is unwieldy and ineffective at regulating newly discovered toxic substances found in consumer products, and that it provides inadequate protection for vulnerable communities. In addition to modernizing the regulation of toxic substances, a hallmark of the bill is its proposal to recognize every Canadian's rights to a healthy environment. Conservative recognize the right of every individual in Canada to a healthy environment, and the government of Canada has a duty to protect that right when administering SEPA, while also considering certain relevant factors, including social, economic, health, and scientific factors. It is useful to note that similar rights currently exist under provincial environmental legislation in some provinces.
Perfect. Thank you. You guys are like burning through these. Great for you. All right. So we're on to question 4. Again, you have up to 1.5 minutes each. And question 4 is this: Indigenous people play a critical role in environmental and climate solutions. Will you implement the United Nations declarations on the right of Indigenous peoples and calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Will you invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas? For this question, Doug is going first, followed by Sarah, and then Tanya. Doug, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thank you, Margaret, for this great question. I, along with people across the country, was deeply saddened when we heard about the discovery of unmarked children's graves on the grounds of residential schools. The TRC and the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls identified significant gaps in opportunities for Indigenous peoples in this country, and we need to close those gaps. Conservatives have a comprehensive plan to implement TRC calls to action 71 through 76. We will also address the ongoing crisis in mental health that has been heightened by COVID-19 by providing $1 billion to boost funding for Indigenous mental health and drug treatment programs. The journey of reconciliation is long and difficult. The Liberal government has repeatedly failed to consult with First Nations and territorial governments before canceling important projects and shutting down opportunities. A Conservative government will recognize Indigenous and treaty rights and work together with Indigenous peoples as partners to resolve long-standing challenges.
Thank you. Sarah, you're second for this question. So for question 4, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We will put into action and fully implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and all 94 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. The time has come for a fundamentally different approach to Crown Indigenous relations in Canada, and one that's based on the recognition of the inherent rights of Indigenous people and self-determination. The New Democrats will work with Indigenous people to co-develop a national action plan for reconciliation, drawing on the calls to action to ensure that Canada's laws, policies, practices are consistent with our human rights commitments, including cultural rights, land rights, and the rights of self-determination and self-government. We want to establish a National Council for Reconciliation to provide oversight and accountability for this process and reporting regularly to both Parliament and Canadians. We also will replace mere consultation with a standard of free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous communities affected by government policies, including for all decisions affecting constitutionally protected land rights and things like energy project reviews. We feel that in particular for the work on infrastructure and climate change that there needs to be an increase of use of renewable energy. And many Indigenous communities have been at the forefront of this move to renewable energy. So we want to support their efforts and transition remote communities away from polluting diesel and harmful fumes towards reliable and clean energy alternatives. The New Democrats are committed to undertaking the important work of reconciliation in good faith and in true and equal partnership. We believe that the Crown's relationship to Indigenous people must be based and acknowledged on our country's colonial history of genocide and stolen lands, and include legally binding commitments to fair and equitable redress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least is Tanya. Your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect, thank you. So this question is a big, huge yes for me. Well, we've made some accomplishments. There is still so much more work to be done. I fully support this effort, as well as the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And on a personal side note, I have recently made my family all read those calls to action, just so that we know what's going on around us. With regard to Indigenous protected areas, Indigenous peoples have been strong allies in working to protect land and waters, often in the face of provincial resistance. To date, we have begun work on 80 Indigenous conserved and protected areas and have launched Indigenous programs across the country. To achieve the 30% protection goal, continued active partnerships with Indigenous peoples will be critical. That is why in budget 2021, we've committed $340 million in additional funding to support Indigenous leadership in nature conservation. All I can say is that we absolutely, undoubtedly must continue to work until all of these commitments are fulfilled.
Thank you. All right, so we've got 3 more questions left of the preset, and then it's going to be audience questions. So audience, the ones that at least are registered through Zoom, the YouTube can't submit, but what you can do is look at the Q&A at the bottom. We ask you to submit any questions, and we'll be vetting those, and time is getting close to the audience questions. So make sure if you have a burning environmental or local environmental question that you submit it. Okay, so now we're on to question 5. As the climate condition worsens, the unhoused or those with precarious housing will be among the most impacted. What measures would you take to ensure housing as a right, which is a tangible climate action? For this question, Sarah is going first, followed by Tanya and then Doug, and the candidates have 1.5 minutes each. Sarah, you are first.
Housing is a human right, and everyone in Canada should have a safe and affordable place to live. And we've got a plan to invest right now to create 500,000 units of quality affordable housing across the country and that will create jobs and build the rental, cooperative, and social housing that is needed so desperately in this country. As a way to kickstart those projects for co-ops and social and nonprofit housing, we want to break the logjam that's prevented these groups from accessing housing funding. So what we want to do is set up a direct fast start fund to streamline applications to help communities get the expertise and assistance they need to get projects off the ground now and not years from now. A new Democratic government will also spur construction of affordable homes by waiving the federal portion of the GST-HST on the construction of affordable rental units. This simple change will help get new units built faster. These measures will help address the housing crisis at the source, but we also need to make sure that families that are hurting get help now, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we want to make sure that people don't have to wait, and that if they're struggling and they're worrying, that we'll get immediate relief to them so that they're not struggling to afford their rent in otherwise suitable housing. Also, to help with the housing market, we're looking to levy 20% on home purchases from foreign investors to help cool the housing market. And we want to make sure that energy efficiency and sustainability and building practices are at the core of our national housing strategy. We need the courage and the meaningful action to build Canada without poverty, where all Canadians can count on quality public service and community supports to help them lead a dignified life. And a core component of our approach is fully implementing the right to housing and working towards the goal of ending homelessness in Canada within a decade. In a country as wealthy as Canada, there's no excuse.
Sorry, Sarah. You're over your time. Sorry, I appreciate that. Hopefully if people want to, they can. Yeah,
I've got a lot to say about it.
No, that's okay. That's fine. And if you do go over time, we suggest that people want to hear more, that they reach out to the candidate specifically about what was left. Tanya, your 1.5 minutes for this question begins now.
Perfect, thank you. I know this is a really top priority in this area. I mean, we've been out talking to residents for several weeks now, and this is housing is always at the top of the concern. And for myself, I know I've been working with the local organization Redwood Park Communities now for several years, and as well as my experience as a real estate agent, I can see firsthand what the lack of affordable housing has done in this area. And I also know from working with Redwood what a huge impact that a safe and affordable home can make to people. So we have to continue our work on housing. I was really pleased with the policy platform that came out with us that we're going to build more affordable houses, 1.4 million affordable houses across the country, introduce a buyer's bill of rights, introduce a rent-to-own program for those who are trying to get into the housing market, introduce a new multi-generational home renovation tax credit to help families expand their homes in case you have multi-families living in a home. So there's a lot of great platform with our party on providing affordable housing. We'll also make conditional investments in Indigenous housing and work with Indigenous partners to co-develop an Indigenous housing strategy and support by dedicated investments. I can promise we will continue to work to end chronic homelessness, because the bottom line here is that everybody deserves a safe place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And finally, for question 5 is Doug, and your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thanks, Margaret. The issue is housing affordability, and it is a serious issue and has become a crisis over the last 6 years under this Liberal government. I have heard from residents in Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte who are being forced out of their community in order to find a home they can afford. This must be a top priority for the next government. There is a serious problem with supply and demand, and Conservatives will swiftly increase housing supply across the country by effectively funding infrastructure projects. That means building public transit infrastructure and requiring cities and towns receiving those federal infrastructure funds to increase density near transit. The federal government is the largest property owner in the country with over 37,000 buildings. A Conservative government will release at least 15% of those properties for housing redevelopment. Another important way to tackle our housing crisis is to root out corrupt activities that are driving up real estate prices and putting homes out of reach. Conservatives will ban foreign investors not living in Canada from buying homes here for at least 2 years. Instead, we will encourage foreign investment in purpose-built rental housing that is affordable. The Conservative plan will ensure Canada's real estate market serves the interests of everyday Canadians first, including young families, recent university grads looking for their first apartment, and retired empty nesters downsizing.
Thank you, Doug. We're on to our second last preset question, and this one is about Lake Simcoe. Again, the candidates have 1.5 minutes. The question is, Lake Simcoe is under increasing pressure from climate impacts as well as urbanization around its shores. To save it, it will require all levels of government to do more than it has historically done, including intervening on projects that are a direct threat to the health of the lake. As such, will you support designating the Bradford Bypass a 4-lane freeway that cuts through the headwaters of Lake Simcoe and the Greenbelt for a federal impact assessment? Will you support a cost-sharing agreement with Ontario to get the Holland River Reclamation Plant online as soon as possible, which will reduce average phosphorus loadings from the Holland River by 40%? For this question, Tanya is going first, followed by Doug, and then Sarah. Tanya, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I will work with all levels of government to ensure that the Bradford Bypass undergoes an environmental assessment. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier questions how residents in this area cherish Lake Simcoe, and we have to protect it. It's a very important thing, and I'm committed to seeing that project through. Just to note that our government will make a historic investment of $1 billion to the Freshwater Action Plan. And this is a plan that will provide essential funding to protect and restore lakes and river systems, which includes our precious Lake Simcoe. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, and then for this, Doug is next at 1.5 minutes. We begin now, Doug.
Thank you, Margaret. The Liberal government announced in February of this year that the Bradford Bypass project would not receive a federal environmental assessment. The project is proceeding and must comply with relevant provisions of federal legislation, including the Canadian Navigable Waters Act, the Fisheries Act, and the Explosives Act. The health and future of Lake Simcoe is of paramount importance to me and the Conservative government. We will reinstate the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund to protect our vital natural resource. During the last election campaign in 2019, I stood on the shores of Lake Simcoe and announced our plan to reinstate the cleanup fund of $30 million. That spurred the Liberal government to come to Barrie with their own $40 million commitment, of which none has been allocated to the project. I have advocated for the reinstatement of the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund to be fulfilled since the last election, and we have heard nothing from the current Liberal government. That tells me and Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte that the Liberals are not serious about protecting Lake Simcoe, but the Conservative Party of Canada is.
Thank you, Doug. And finally, we have Sarah. Your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Okay, so can we just cut to the chase and stop calling it the Bradford Bypass? And I know it as the Holland Marsh Highway because it's going to run through some of the most important wetlands in Ontario. So yes, we need a federal environmental assessment on this project, and the Liberals ordered one for the proposed 413, but not for this project, which doesn't make sense to me. And right now it's using an assessment from the late 90s when grunge rock was cool the first time. And that's just not acceptable because climate leaders don't build highways, full stop. So what I see with respect to our region's growth, what I see is a need to support forward-thinking initiatives that look for green solutions of how we get around. And an NDP government will focus on green infrastructure such as public transit, as well as looking at our communities and helping minimize urban sprawl by creating good jobs where we live. So that's all part of it. We need to make sure that we're not building a highway that is going to be congested again another 10 years after it's done. It's not an acceptable way forward. I am excited to share with you that there have been preliminary conversations between NDP candidates whose ridings are connected to Lake Simcoe regarding the possibility of a Lake Simcoe NDP coalition. So these 7 ridings represent a little over 2% of the House of Commons, and we'll have more power if we can vote as a bloc on these issues that are so pertinent to our community. So I'm very excited to be able to share that with you today. It's definitely something that I'm really excited about being able to do for you.
Thank you, Sarah. Our final preset question, 1.5 minutes again. And this one is about the urgency of the climate crisis. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, our government's committed to spending what it takes to ensure the safety of our citizens. According to climate and economy experts, we need to spend 2% of our GDP on climate action and green infrastructure, and another 2% on a just transition and social infrastructure to ensure no one is left behind. That would be about $80 billion annually. Given the urgency of the climate emergency, are you prepared to spend what it takes to contribute to the global effort to avoid the worst of the climate crisis and its social and economic impacts? And for this question, we have Tanya going first, followed by Doug, and then finally Sarah. And Tanya, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect, thank you. So I think that our accomplishments speak for themselves. Since 2015, our government has been doing the work. We have made record investments in the environment, have a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples, increased taxes on the wealthy, and have made investments in green infrastructure. We know clearly there's more to do to tackle climate change and advance reconciliation, to make life more affordable for Canadians, and to grow a sustainable green economy. We have a climate plan that has been recognized as marvelous by Tom Mulcair, the former leader of Canada's NDP, as well as bold and thoughtful by Andrew Weaver, the former leader of the BC Green Party, and effective and economically efficient policies, and that's from Mark Jacquard, the climate expert. Our government has the best climate plan. We just cannot risk voting in a government that will take us backwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Doug, for question 7, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Thank you. Conservatives are committed to protecting the environment. In fact, our party was built by farmers, hunters, and anglers, people who respect and live off the land and waters that we need to conserve. We all want to create a green future for our children. We will invest in programs that will support that commitment, including building public transit and other major infrastructure projects across the country in urban and rural communities. We are also focused on cleaning up our waters and protecting water quality, including Lake Simcoe. That means ending raw sewage dumping into our lakes, rivers, and oceans, and protecting our waterways from pollution, something Justin Trudeau has failed to do. A greener environment also means tackling the challenge of plastic waste, and Conservatives will ban the export of plastic waste. Liberals voted against a private member's bill from Conservative Scott Davidson of which I was the seconder, that would have stopped the export of Canada's plastic waste to other countries.
Thank you, Doug. And then finally, Sarah, 1.5 minutes for this question begins now.
So yes, and Tanya, I agree with you that we can't go backwards. This is too urgent. And we've seen with COVID-19 that emergencies need to be tackled urgently, can be so with the political will to do so. And Canadians have been doing their part to fight this urgent public health emergency, and we need to tackle climate change with that same sense of urgency. It hasn't gone away. We're committed to avoiding the worst case scenario and doing what it takes and what the science requires to avoid the worst of the climate crisis and the social economic impacts. Our approach to raising revenues in order to fund such commitments will put people first and tackle the inequality crisis facing our country, strengthen the integrity of our tax system, and ensure that large profitable corporations and the very richest pay more to help us get there. You know, I've seen talk online about our platform and criticism that up against our plan in terms of the cost and it being unrealistic, but I have to say that that assessment did not consider the cost of doing nothing, which would be much more. And there's nothing realistic about a plan that doesn't get us to the targets that science demands and that no previous government has been able to get us to.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so thank you, candidates, for those answers to preset questions. Now we're going to see what the audience wants us to answer. So the questions have been vetted for relevance, decorum, and ability to be proposed to all candidates. Again, each candidate will have 1.5 minutes to respond to the 3 questions that have been selected from the submitted audience questions. If you have questions that were not answered here today, then I encourage you to reach out to each of the candidates and their campaigns personally. So, Kelly, if you could pass me the first question. Okay, the first question is, what is the maximum population that Canada can support at our standard of living? And for the order, it goes Doug, then Sarah, and then Tanya. So the question again is, what is the maximum population that Canada can support at our standard of living? And you have 1.5 minutes. Doug, you can start now.
Well, Margaret, this is going to be an interesting answer, and I love to give you this because the number one thing I've heard as I've been elected official now for almost over a decade is that I am one of the most normal sounding politicians and don't do political speak very well. I don't have the answer to that question, so I don't ever make up answers. And I don't try to please people just by saying things. I don't know what the answer to that is. I know we're here today to talk about our environmental plan, which we have an excellent plan, but the answer to that question, I don't have.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I don't know what the answer would be if I answered it, Doug, so don't worry. Okay, Sarah, you're up next. 1.5 minutes.
I wish I could pull a figure out of my head as well, but I don't know. But what I do know is that something will need to change, and population density and projects that encourage population density in existing areas rather than urban sprawl would be part of a means of mitigating the impacts of being able to maintain that.
Okay. Thank you. And then Tanya, you have the last crack at that question.
Thank you. And I'll give full transparency because I was able to go last. I was able to look it up. So sorry, Doug and Sarah. So according to Google, it's 75 million within 50 years and 100 million by the end of the 21st century. And I think that the most important thing that we have to look at here is that the way that this climate emergency is evolving, we're not sustainable. So we have to take action now in order to slow things down and prevent things from getting much, much worse at a faster pace. So I'm sorry that I had the numbers, guys, but I think that we also all know that, climate change is real and climate change needs to be addressed, and we have to act now. Thanks.
No worries. And I just for everybody, I don't think the person was looking for a specific number anyways. I think they want to, so it's okay, Tanya. I'm glad you were able to find a number, but I think everyone was just looking at the spirit of, how much can we continue to grow and what does that look like? Okay, so for question 2, we are talking about waters. So Canada has no national strategy to protect our waters from pollution and privatization. Do you agree that protecting water from pollution is an economic priority? What is your position on privatization? I guess that would mean of water and wastewater. And are you prepared to support measures to spend what it takes to provide First Nations with clean water? So you got a few little questions in there. One about, and I believe Kelly can send those questions to you as well, so you can read it, panelists. So for this question, we have Sarah going first, followed by Tanya, and then Doug. So Sarah, your 1.5 minutes goes now.
Okay, so I agree that protecting our water from pollution is an economic priority. Our water is life, and we need to make sure that we're moving forward. And the NDP is proposing a national freshwater strategy to help protect our waters. In terms of privatization, I think when it comes to privatization, we need to look at the greater good and understand that businesses that are there to support the health of Canadians need to have either strong government oversight or not be privatized. I don't want to buy back the water that I should have access to. And yes, I'm prepared to support measures to spend what it takes to get First Nations with clean water. That is imperative. And it's a shame that under previous governments and current governments that has not already happened. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanya, you're up next.
Perfect, thank you. Do I agree that it's an economic priority? Yes, and if elected, I look forward to working with everybody in caucus to achieve it. And again, we have the strongest climate plan that we've ever had, and that speaks for itself. For the boil water advisories, I mean, again, I think it was mentioned earlier, everybody has a right to clean drinking water. And so that's a big one. And I know that 109 long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted, and those that are remaining are in the process of being lifted, but it's not done until it's done. And we have to continue to work until this is complete. And I know we are investing $4.27 billion to achieve that. So this is a huge one, and I can't reiterate enough that we have to get this done. Everybody deserves clean drinking water, and we need to keep moving forward to make sure that happens at a rapid pace. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. And then finally, Doug, you have up to 1.5 minutes for this question.
Thank you. And I'd like to start off my question by just addressing something Tanya just mentioned when she apologized for having that number. Tanya, never be sorry for bringing forward good information. Before we started talking today, the three of us had a nice collegial chat, and we talked about how we were running this campaign on a nice, proper, decent level. And good information from anybody is always good information. So please, I don't take that as an insult that you had the audacity to look that up quicker. I give you the kudos and thank you for bringing that number forward, because that's what we're all here to do, is for the future and betterment of all residents. So thank you for that. In regards to clean drinking water, yes, our party takes that issue very serious. I'd like to bring up two issues that have happened fairly currently. In the last parliament, as I was sitting there in the 43rd parliament, there was a private member's bill brought up to ban the dumping of raw sewage. And all the Conservative members voted for it. Every member of the Liberals and NDPs voted against that bill, so it failed. So we're bringing forward tangible bills that can help. Obviously, for partisan reasons, it was voted down, but that's something we brought forward. I'd like to also mention the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund, which was a Conservative initiative brought forward many, many years ago, canceled by this Trudeau government, who's talked about bringing it back, never has. We've promised, we've put it in our commitments, now in our platform, that we will reinstate the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund to make sure there's good, clean water for all of us to enjoy and use going forward. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. And then we have our final audience question. Again, I encourage people that did not get their question answered and would like to know the answers to these questions, please reach out to the candidates. Their campaign team wants to speak to their constituents. So email them, call them, whatever you need to do. So the final question here is, and Kelly will be panelist, she'll be putting it in the chat so you can read it yourself as well. But how will you address the root causes of the climate change and loss of biodiversity crises, namely the disregard for and the lack of human compassion for all things? So you might have to go off the platform a little bit here. So again, how will you address the root causes of climate change, loss of biodiversity crises, namely the disregard for and the lack of human compassion for all things? For this particular question, we have Tanya going first, followed by Doug, and then Sarah. So Tanya, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the question. I just want to answer it quickly and simply by saying that we do have the Species at Risk Fund, as well as the making record investments in biodiversity. So it is absolutely something that it needs to be addressed. And I don't know what it says, the disregard for and lack of human compassion for all things. I think that me personally, I do have human compassion for all things. That's why I'm sitting in this seat on this panel today, because it is important to me to listen to people, have compassion, have a human connection, and bring a voice forward that represents the residents that live here and whatever is important. So I'll just end it on that. And thanks again.
Thank you, Tanya. All right, Doug, your up to 1.5 minutes begins now for this question.
Thank you. And I gotta admit, every time you say Doug, Margaret, I jump to reach for my mute button. So if I look like I'm jumping in my seat, I am. And I always keep forgetting that. So usually in moderation, someone else is running it. So thank you. And if I look like I'm jumping, I am trying to unmute. So thank you for that great question. We have seen very clearly this summer how wildfires, droughts, flooding, and extreme weather events can impact all Canadians. We also know that climate change increases the risk of these events. Conservatives will build resiliency and better prepare Canada for the impacts of our changing climate by appointing a National Disaster Resilience Advisory to the Privy Council office to advise Cabinet and the PMO and ensure the government is prepared for future risks. We will also invest in technology that will improve the early detection of wildfires and better predict their behavior. And we will work with the provinces and territories to develop a natural infrastructure plan. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. I'm sorry for scaring you there, Doug, every time I say your name. I know I'm quite intimidating. Anyways, just kidding. Sarah, your 1.5 minutes for this question begins now.
Thanks so much. And yes, loss of biodiversity is a crisis and is contributing. There's a lot of root causes to climate change, and we are definitely committed to helping protect through the Species at Risk Act, not only enforcing that act, but also launching a 10-year nature plan to help reverse species loss. And as I mentioned before as well, we're planning on working with farmers and communities to monitor and support and protect pollinator health. And so that's a big part of that as well for species and biodiversity. In terms of the lack of compassion for all human things, I can't help but think of the kids' song, because that's just my life. There wasn't a lady who swallowed a fly, right? And so this idea, this snowball effect, and I think through our platforms and through working with other community organizations, we can definitely help to raise education about that integrated nature of our climate. And I think with the emergence of viruses and coronaviruses that we're experiencing this pandemic, I think there's a respect and there's starting to be an understanding of the intricacy and delicacy that is necessary to approach species loss and looking how climate change impacts that.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so now we're on to the closing remarks, and the candidates will have 2 minutes for this. So the order for speakers for this portion is Doug, followed by Tanya, and then Sarah. Again, for 2 minutes. Doug, you can begin your closing remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you again to Margaret and your group for organizing this. Thanks to you to my fellow candidates for putting your names in to be elected. I know it's a tough grind for 5 weeks. You're putting yourself out there as I am, and wish you all but the best of luck in the next week and a half left to go. In closing, I want to emphasize that the Conservative Party's plan to secure the environment has been reviewed and endorsed by many top leading environmentalists. It is a serious plan that I am proud to support. I'd like to quote Dale Begwin, Vice President of Research and Analysis at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, who stated, quote, "First, credit where credit is due for a serious plan. They've used modeling to ensure no magical thinking. They're relying on policies that will drive real emissions reductions. They are taking climate policy seriously," end quote. I would once again like to thank the organizers and my fellow candidates for this informative discussion today. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you to all for tuning in and listening to the Conservative plan to combat climate change.
Thank you, Doug. Tanya, you can begin your closing remarks. You have 2 minutes.
Perfect. And I also wanted to thank you for hosting us today, and thank Doug and Sarah for being here. It was nice to, I guess, technically see you guys, even though we're on video. It was nice to see you and get a break from being out on the streets. So I just want to wrap it up by saying that I am proud to be a representative of the Liberal Party. I feel that the platform that was really, it shows that we're taking a lot of things into consideration and making them priorities. The fight against climate change is one. Finishing the fight against COVID-19, providing stronger healthcare for everyone, providing better housing, the $10 a day childcare, and then last but certainly not least is continuing on the path to reconciliation. And I appreciate everybody coming to listen today, to get to know me a little better, and I look forward to talking to more of you face to face and having the opportunity to represent in Ottawa. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Tanya. And finally, Sarah.
Well, thank you. And it was great to see you guys as well. I do want to just say that, our climate plan is bold, but it's not magical. It's as big as the crisis itself. And it's as big as what we need to combat that crisis. The Liberals have set emission targets and not met them. And they've not done enough to help prevent the consequences from warming above 1.5 degrees. And kudos, Conservatives, for having a plan, but it was glaringly missing in your platform in 2019. 2 years ago, the House of Commons declared climate change as an emergency, and combating this existential threat, one of the greatest threats facing Canadians and our planet, will take more than talk, and it's time to do better. And only Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have a plan to fight the climate crisis and win, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies once and for all. We're going to undo the Liberals' decisions to let big polluters off the hook. We're going to cut emissions by more than half to meet those 1.5 degree targets that scientists say are necessary to prevent catastrophe. We're going to create jobs by investing in clean energy and energy efficient, affordable homes, zero emission vehicles, and electric transit, retrofit homes, and create a climate bank to invest in fighting climate emergency instead of an infrastructure bank that only aims to enrich investors. So on September 20th, the NTP are the clear choice to bring about real change to treat the climate crisis with the urgency necessary to secure a better future for us all. My name is Saari Lochhead, and I look forward to representing Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte, and Ottawa and get this done.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our audience and to our candidates for sharing their time with us. We appreciate the amount of time and hard work. It is running a campaign. It's a busy time. So we appreciate all of you and wish you all the best in your campaigns. We hope that this discussion has helped voters across the riding to inform their choices. We appreciate the decline. We appreciate that the decline of our environment and climate is distressing and frightening. However, we have the power to participate in a democracy to insist that the choices we make in the future support a livable planet and healthy communities. So we encourage each of you to vote and encourage others to vote as well. Advanced polls open on September 10th for those that want to vote without the crowds, and the official voting day is September 20th. And beyond voting, continue to connect with your future MP and hold them accountable to the promises they made here today and throughout the campaign. They cannot represent people adequately if they never hear from them. So please make sure you're continually contacting and in touch with your federal representatives. The video recording of this will be hosted on our YouTube channel. We'll be sending a follow-up email to all registrants with the link so you can share with your network. And as I said before, if you didn't get your question asked, or if you still have more questions, I encourage you to reach out to the candidates and ask them if they come to the door. To close, I'll share my favorite quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small, committed group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. Wish you guys all the best, and thank you all for being here. Audience, thank you for being here. And September 20th, make sure you get out and vote. Have a wonderful day, everybody.